Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is Kristen Eldon-Wiley, and I am a program officer at Templeton World Charity Foundation. I'm excited to be hosting this webinar today with two fantastic experts, Mark Musen and Mark Hahnel. I'm pleased that you can both be here today, and I'm also pleased that all the participants can be here on our fourth webinar of our Open Science webinar series. Each month, we bring to you experts on open science. Next month, we've organized a webinar on the benefits of pre-registration for both the research and the researcher. In November, we will bring together a few of our very own project directors who have pre-registered their research funded by TWCF. But the aim of this webinar today is to dive into sharing research data. Mark Hahnel is the CEO and the founder of Figshare, which he created while he was completing his PhD in stem cell biology at Imperial College London. Figshare currently provides research data infrastructure for institutions, publishers, and funders globally. He's passionate about open science and the potential it has to revolutionize the research community. Mark. Mark Musen is a professor of biomedical informatics at Stanford University, where he is a director of the Stanford Center for Biomedical Informatics Research. Dr. Musen conducts research related to open science, data stewardship, intelligent systems, and biomedical decision support. He is principal investigator of the Center of Expanded Data Annotation and Retrieval, CEDAR. CEDAR is a center of excellence supported by the NIH Big Data of Knowledge initiative, with the goal of developing new technology to ease the authoring and management of biomedical experimental metadata. Hi, Mark. After both Mark and Mark have given their presentations, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. Please add questions to the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. We also encourage you to use the raise the hand function so that we'll be happy to give you the floor to ask a question. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website in a few days. And with that, I will pass the mic over to Mark Hahnel. Mark? Stop my share.
Thank you very much. So many marks.
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully you can all see my screen. And please, if you have any questions at the end, just let me know. I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes or so. As Kristen mentioned, I do have an interesting aspect on this, and I like to think about what is in it for the researchers. Why should we be thinking about open science, open research, open data, open everything? If it's going to either harm your career or if it's, where are the incentive structures? And I really like to think about both sides of this, because when what I like to think about now is this, what is called the fourth paradigm of research, which is academia works, research outputs work, we get new drugs, but how can we move further, faster? We've seen this with COVID, you know, that we've had this huge influx of preprints and open research data. My mum now understands how to interpret, you know, graphs and understand that the data behind the decisions that are being made most of the time in most parts of the world. But how can we move to this data-driven decision making, and how can we make academia more efficient by using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and things that really can help us go further, faster? And the other side to this, of course, is, as was mentioned, I was a researcher myself, and I had a lot of videos of stem cells moving from one side of the screen to the other. I had a lot of spreadsheet data. Research is getting more computational no matter what field you're in. If you're doing cancer genomics, or if you're doing, you know, social sciences, you're generating files. Everybody works on a computer. And so I had these videos and these data sets, and when I went to publish them with traditional publishers, there was nowhere to publish them because they couldn't, their tech infrastructure wasn't good enough to take 5 megabyte video files. So I started something called Figshare.com, which was for sharing my own research outputs in the first instance. And I want to be very clear about this. So anybody can go to Figshare.com and upload their files, add some metadata, and make them publicly available. But when we're thinking about why people should be sharing their research data. As I said, I think it's that ability to move knowledge further faster. But we have these three cartoons here where you have different kind of areas that people are looking at, which are the data are mine on the left-hand side, you know, this idea that these are mine, and why should I make my data available and have my peers look at my data and get an advantage over me? We you know, a lot of academia is competing for the same grants, for the same money, and so you have to separate yourselves from your peers. The other good reason for making data openly available is if you're more transparent around data, then we can see if there's mistakes. There was a classic faster than light neutrinos paper that came out, and the researchers said this ignores the rules of physics. Can somebody help me? They found out what the problem was with the data by being transparent about it. There's this software development term, which is many eyes make all bugs shallow. And that's the idea that if everybody's looking at it from a different angle, you can find new things. It's good for finding error, but it's also good for finding things that you might not find yourselves. And then for a lot of research, there's this, you know, the taxpayer is the person who's funded that research. Is not true for all research, as you know, with TW, but it raises the different dynamics. And I want to be very clear here that I started sharing my data not for any of these reasons. I built Figshare because I wanted to have more impact. It's kind of closest to the scene on the left here. It wasn't that I wanted to protect my data in that, you know, I didn't want my peers to get ahead. I wanted to go to interviews for research funding and postdocs and say, look at everything I've created and look at the impact here. And that's the thing. What we're seeing is a lot of funders, the NIH have from January 2023, they're going to be mandating that you publish the data at the time that you publish the paper. And a lot of the more forward-thinking funders are starting to come up with open data policies, open access policies, because they can. And they have a lot more control. And it's ultimately to move to be more efficient with the research process, to allow the technology that we have to go looking for those new patterns in the data that we as humans even may not be able to see. And so we want to understand exactly how we can motivate researchers and what's in it for you, what's in it for you as a researcher, how we can help you help yourselves. And so each year we do a State of Open Data survey. The next one will be coming out in October. We've done this for the past 6 years, I think. It's the largest longitudinal study around academic research open data. And so you can see here we get somewhere near 10,000 responses from the research community. And what's actually happening is the research community is demanding the more enforcement of the mandates that have been adopted by many of the governments, funders, publishers, and institutions around the world. It is a global phenomenon. There is this move to more open academic research around the world, whether it's China, North America, the UK, where I am, and Western Europe. And this was a strange finding that we got in the State of Open Data. For me, it was strange. For you, it might make sense. But in the academic world that I grew up in, when it was very, you know, dog eat dog, you have to fight for the funding, then as I mentioned, I wanted to prioritize my research. And I want to say, look at all of this great stuff that I've done. You should be funding me because I've had all of this impact from all of these different types of outputs, not just the academic paper. And so this idea here, should funders make, on the left-hand side, should the funders make sharing of research data part of requirements for awarding grants? And strikingly to me, nearly 70% said yes to that question of academics asked. And should funders penalize the researchers who do not share their data? And 2/3 said yes. And I think it comes back to this, if I go back here, this on the left here, this idea that if I make my data available, am I at a disadvantage to my peers if I'm giving them more information to build their research off, but they're not reciprocating? And so this is what I infer this information to be, is if the funder is telling us that we all have to do this, then we immediately have an even playing field. Everybody makes their data available because they have to. And if they have to, then I can benefit from their research data in the same way that they can benefit from my research data. So we're on an even playing field, but at the same time, we still get that ability to, as a kind of sub-construct, make more data available for the other people to consume in ways that we'd never think about. And particularly in the machine learning and artificial intelligence world, we saw it recently with DeepMind with their protein folding structure tool that they brought out. It just, by applying information in this way, we can find patterns that we couldn't find. What's really interesting about this is the better the metadata, the better the description. And I think Mark's talk after this is going to dig into this a little bit. Getting files available on the internet was the first phase. Now you need descriptive files so we can have lots of homogeneous data, so we can query it in ways where we can find patterns, no matter if the research was created in Tanzania or Alaska. We can, if it's treated in the same way and it's described in the same way, we can start inferring things for that. But I wanted to talk about why this is good for the researchers, right? And so we already have data supporting that it is a good thing for you in your career to make your data available. And so the linking papers to their supporting data in a repository was associated with, on average, a 25% increase in citations to the paper. So as I mentioned, we build repositories at Figshare for organizations like the Department of Homeland Security or Carnegie Mellon, but we also have a free version, figshare.com. So if you're looking for a place to make your data available and you don't have one, the message is always find a subject-specific repository, because they have more dedicated staff for that particular subject and going towards that homogeneous data that I talked about. But if you don't, there's repositories like figshare.com or Zenodo where you can make your data available, and there's no barrier to entry there. So describe it as well as you can, but you can go to figshare.com and upload your files. So on the left here, you can see we accept any file format. We aim to preview them in the browser. So we started with data sets and videos, which was my research outputs, right? And what we then moved on to was we saw people have lots of different file formats. And so accepting any file format and trying to preview them in the browser. We support version control. We give everything a DOI. You can see version 2 down here. You can cite it. It gets a DOI. And so on the left here, you can see this is a Jupyter notebook. The bottom right here is a Gephi map. So lots of different file formats. And then in the middle here, you know, a spinny dinosaur tooth, which is really good for incentivizing researchers. My old boss, if she had a spinny dinosaur tooth as an STL file, and she was trying to publish it through the traditional publishing route, they'd say, oh, can you just take a few images of this? Which really pulls away from, it's removing information from the research that you're sharing. So I find being able to publish your data in the format that it was created is hugely important. And for interoperability going forward, having it available as an open standard file format is also very important. So we should be thinking about that. The other thing that we want to do is try and work with researchers where they are. So we have the ability to sync your GitHub account, your GitLab account, your Bitbucket account. And this idea that if you're already quite computational and you're using these tools, the idea is that you can put it somewhere where it will persist. And this is the difference. You know, why can't I put my videos on YouTube? Does that not solve the problem? Well, you might get a wider audience because, you know, all I tend to do all day is watch YouTube. So it's replaced television for me. But those links are not persistent. You can have that video. I could take down that video at any time. So someone might say, here is those 10,000 brain image videos that I shared. Here's where you can find them on YouTube. And then one day they might leave academia and delete them. It's called link rot. Then you don't have the data behind it. So we also have that with platforms like GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket. Great for doing research on, but actually not persistent. So that's one of the core things we do, is just make sure that that data will persist for forever. And the DOI, the digital object identifier, the role that that has, so when you cite the DOI, it will always point to the version of record. So even if the link structure changes, it will always point to the right thing. The other thing that we'll make sure is that your data is discoverable in the right places. So if it is a data set, it will end up in Google Dataset Search. If it is a document or a thesis or anything like this, we'll make sure it ends up in Google Scholar. And then I wanted to just touch a little bit more on this kind of impact. Why should I share my research outputs, and what is the impact that you can have? So we started trying to make sure that the researchers who were using the platform could see the impact that all of their research outputs were having, get credit for all of your research. So here is a data set, it's some code, PivLab, and you can see that it had been cited 66 times. So this is just a bit of software, but we track the citations, we track it cumulative of all the versions. So there's 16 different versions, and cumulatively they've had 66 citations because they are just one research output. We also track views and downloads. And then you can click through and see the citations. We partner with a sister organization called Dimensions to say, for this DOI, here are all the citations, and you can see the papers that have cited this particular data set. You may have also noticed as well, it's got this circle here with a 1 in. This is called an altmetric donut. So we also track this. So this is some research outputs. It's a data set on United States commutes and mega regions. It's basically remapping the United States based on where people commute to work. So you have states, but if you just put the commuter belt from around different cities, it re-envisions where everybody is. And so this is a lot of file format visualization in maps. It's raw data, but you can see it's not been traditionally cited as yet. So there's 5 different versions of it. It's had, more than 10,000 downloads, 50,000 views, but you can say, well, there's no traditional impact. No papers have referenced this, and therefore I'm not getting the impact I need. But what the altmetric donut does is it tracks the DOI, the persistent identifier, around different social platforms. So it tracks news websites, it tracks blogs, it tracks policy documents. So other areas, if you're in nursing and you write you create some research output that is used a lot by nurses, it'll be in policy documents more than it's in the traditional literature. So you want to highlight that. And also, if it's getting a lot of attention, this is the idea that you can track all of the impact of all of your research outputs, whether it's a poster, a data set, or 10,000 videos. And this is something that moves us away from the one metric rules us all mentality, but it also shows you that the better, more descriptive you are with your content, the more likely people are going to discover it, the more impact it's going to have. And so when you're thinking about your research data and your research outputs, think about a few things. One, what is the end goal here? Why would you prevent research from moving faster? As a researcher, that's probably what you're in it for, to help move humanity forward. And then if you think about the traditional publication process of papers, this is a nice paper which breaks it down into what is publishing actually at the academic level. And so on one level, you've got the storage and identification. The files are going to hang around forever, and we can identify them using a persistent identifier. So that is what repositories like Figshare and other repositories can do for you as a free service, make your data available. And you need to think about, okay, the stamping and the feedback, at some level, that is peer review traditionally. So what is this big section in the middle? Preparation, publication, search, and marketing, right? This is where you need to describe your data very, very well. If you call your data set, it's never going to get found. If you describe it as the data set behind this paper, then people will go to Google, they will find your data, and it gives us a whole new way of thinking. And this is this is my last slide, just talking about the old way of thinking was people find academic publications and then every bit of information is plugged through that, right? And this isn't how the web works. This isn't what the internet was designed for, sharing academic data. This is why the World Wide Web, why DARPANET existed, for sharing academic data between research organizations. So now the web has moved on, and we can think about it by different levels of, so I can just find a researcher. I think this is why we need persistent identifiers for everything, and say, so this researcher with this ORCID, pull them out and then be able to see everything they've done, as opposed to having to go through the publication. And it's this web of information that allows people to get better answers, that allows people to build on top of the research that's gone beforehand in a much more efficient way. So do make your data available, do describe it well. And if you have any questions, you can find me at mark@figshare.com or on Twitter, and I'd be happy to answer them. Or if you have any questions at the end of these discussions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them. So that's everything from me. Short but sweet. Hopefully encourages some more data sharing and the positive aspects of it for all of the researchers who are looking to do so.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think you give a really good case for why TWCF should maybe look at our open access policy and think about making the data sharing requirements a bit more meatier around there.
Have my vote.
Again. Mark Musen. I see your screen, but I don't see you. There you come. Hi. See you now. Okay. Go ahead, take it away.
Sure, and I'm realizing that my screen is showing subtitles. How do I turn that off? This is interesting. Pardon? This must be an advanced version of Zoom. Or else I'll just let this go if this is not getting in the way for people. But this is really
I will look into it, but in the meantime, I think you can take it away.
Okay, really sorry about that. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks again for inviting me. This is really nice to be able to join you. I'm talking about metadata, which sounds like a really boring topic, but I think it's actually an incredibly important topic in the whole area of data sharing. I'm not sure if this has come up previously in this seminar series, but gee, about 6 years ago, the world kind of turned upside down when this paper came out in Scientific Data, arguing that data, when it's put online, need to be fair, that data need to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And within moments of this paper appearing, the world just became crazy about making data fair. Everybody wanted to have fair data. Everybody claimed that his or her data was already fair. And the big trend came to be, how can we claim that our data are fair? Because obviously, if our data are not findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, all the good things that Mark just talked about in his talk would never happen. People argue that there should be principles for what constitutes fair data. And the paper actually enumerated about 15 different principles, which people actually don't memorize at all and don't worry about in detail. But when you look at what were the principles suggested for making data fair, almost all of them deal about metadata. And more than that, they deal about things like making metadata rich, making sure the metadata use controlled vocabularies that follow the FAIR principles, that are richly described, that are adherent to community standards. And it really became a challenge for people to think about, well, what does it mean for all of this to take place? How do we have metadata that abide by all these properties? In particular, how do we make them rich? How do we make them community relevant? And how can we make our data fair as a consequence? I'm going to argue that's all important, but you know, most data are not fair, despite whatever claims people make, because the metadata that exist online are really terrible. I'm not going to talk about Figshare. I have no idea about Figshare metadata. Mark can speak to that. But looking at a lot of the scientific metadata that I deal with in my work, which is largely metadata in national repositories, we find that investigators don't view their work as publishing data. They view their work as publishing papers. Sponsors may require data sharing, but they usually don't argue that their grant money should pay for it. And creating metadata is really hard. Those of you who are investigators know that to create metadata typically requires filling in really complicated spreadsheets. And often the spreadsheets contain errors. The spreadsheets don't tell you how to use control terms or standards. And that can be really problematic. What that means is when you look at the metadata in online repositories, you see metadata entries that are not searchable, that don't tell you what the experiments were, that really don't provide the information that they really should. And even when you look at metadata that seem plausibly reasonable, when you squint a little bit, you see that the disease here is carcinoma hepatocellular, which is kind of inverted. The ethnicity is Japanese. Most people think of Japanese not as an ethnicity, but perhaps as a political affiliation. Age is given as 57 year, singular. Again, something that you wouldn't really search for very easily. And so what do you do about this? And what does it mean for the scientific enterprise? Well, when you go to the big repositories that are managed by organizations like the National Institutes of Health in the United States, we looked at Biosample, which is one of the more modern, more relatively complete, so to speak, repositories. Go to Biosample, 73% of the data that are supposed to be Boolean are not actually true or false. Their values like non-smoker, former smoker, and all kinds of strings. 26% of the metadata values that are supposed to be integers can't be parsed as numbers. 68% of the metadata entries that are supposed to represent terms from biomedical ontologies are not terms from biomedical ontologies. And so what are you going to do? Go to older databases like GEO, the Gene Expression Omnibus. Look at how people talk about the age of the subject. And you see terms like age and age and age and pop age and age after birth and age in years and like 30 different ways to talk about age. Well, if I want my data to be findable, if I want them to be accessible, if I want them to be interoperable and reusable, I need a standard way for talking about age, or else my data will never be fair. What do we do? Well, 20 years ago, in the biomedical community concerned with DNA microarrays, people got together and said, look, if we're going to describe our experimental results in the literature, we have to have a standardized way for talking about those results. We need metadata that will actually allow somebody else to figure out what we did when we did a study. And they said, okay, well, we're publishing about this kind of work. We need to talk about what was the substrate of the experiment, what array platform was used, what were the experimental conditions, yada, yada, yada. They identified a whole set of features that needed to be described in metadata for those metadata to be used by other people in a reasonable way. And they created something they called Miami, the minimal information about a microarray experiment. A great acronym, but more important, was one of the first widely used checklists that provided a standard for describing what metadata need to be incorporated into a metadata record in order for the data sets themselves to be reusable. And then it didn't stop with Miami. There was more great acronyms. There was MIATA, minimal information about T-cell assays, Miriam, minimal information required in the annotation of biochemical models, Mini-MES, MISFISHY, and hundreds of these reporting guidelines designed to help people in biology to describe what's in a metadata, what should be in the metadata to describe a particular experiment. And the biologists may have been the first to do this kind of work, but other areas of science are now picking up the mantle and starting to think about what it would mean to come up with reporting guidelines to make it clear what data need to be described in order for those data to be fair. Frankly, if we want our data to be fair, we need reporting guidelines like Miami that can say, what is it about the data that we need to say in some sort of structured way? We need ontologies that provide controlled terms so that we can fill out these reporting guidelines, not with just arbitrary strings like smoker and non-smoker, but with actually terms from ontologies that tell us precisely what those values might mean. And frankly, we need technology to make it all easy, because we're talking about standards that are not necessarily going to be easy to use. So we've been working for a few years at Stanford on an approach called CEDAR. CEDAR works from the basis of translating reporting guidelines into metadata templates that allow investigators to fill in the blanks to describe their data sets. And we link all of that to a repository of ontologies that make sure that when those reporting guidelines get filled in, people are using standardized terms. The goal here is to create the rich community-based standards and to make those standards available at the time that metadata are authored so that the corresponding data sets are fair. So here's what a metadata template looks like in CEDAR. This is actually a metadata template for the biosample repository at NIH. And what you can see is there's a set of attribute value pairs where along the left-hand side, we have the field names and the field values. Whenever possible, those field values are going to be actual terms from ontologies. And this kind of a template, by filling it in, makes the metadata rich, because we know up front what are the values that need to be presented for any particular kind of experiment. We also know that the vocabularies that we use to provide those controlled terms are themselves fair. They come from our FAIR ontology repository. And we know that they meet community standards because the communities themselves were responsible for creating the templates that allow us to do all this work. So in CEDAR, we have the ability to provide the user with a library of metadata templates. If we're interested in, for example, what does the template look like for the biosample human repository at NIH, and we can click on populate. Here's the template itself. It has sample name, organism, tissue, sex, isolate, and so on. This is basically a reporting guideline for what needs to be in this particular metadata repository. And I can fill it in. I can say the sample name is 56, the organism is Homo sapiens, the tissue is, well, here's a drop-down list. We get a drop-down list because the author of the template said that whenever an investigator is describing metadata that are going to go into this biosample human repository, and they describe the tissue, we want the tissue to come from a controlled ontology that has standardized terms for anatomical tissue descriptions. And what CEDAR also does is because it has a cache, a repository of all the previously entered metadata instances, it knows that when the organism is Homo sapiens, the most commonly selected tissue type is blood. And the next most commonly selected tissue type is liver. And so CEDAR is able to sort the entries in these drop-down lists so that the most commonly selected values will be at the top, making it really easy to fill in the template to describe the corresponding metadata. What that means is if I'm filling in the biosample human template, I've already said my tissue is lung, I need to specify what is the disease of the subject from which this particular specimen was taken. I can see that what's at the top of my list is lung cancer, what's next is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. CEDAR is sorting the possible diseases that come from the disease ontology so that I can make a selection of a controlled term, and I can do it such that given the context of everything else that's been entered into this template, the selections that are most likely to be selected are again at the top of the list, making it really easy for the investigator. If I say that my tissue is brain, then I get the same list, but it's resorted so that brain diseases are more likely to be at the top, again, making it really easy for the investigator to make the right selections out of this particular menu. So really, if we want to have fair data, we need to have good metadata. And if we want good metadata, we need reporting guidelines like Miami that provide a uniform structure telling us what it is about the data that we should even say. And we want ontologies that provide controlled terms so that when we say it, we're saying it in a consistent manner that we can search on so we can find the results that we're interested in. And frankly, I think it helps if we have technology that makes it easy to author the metadata in a way that takes advantage of the reporting guidelines and the ontologies in a way which is hopefully just as easy as filling in a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets are easy, spreadsheets are convenient, we all know them, but we don't want spreadsheets. We want something that's going to give us better metadata. We don't want to be stuck with terms that are not searchable or interoperable. We want to get rid of these kinds of variances and use terms from ontologies where the information is controlled. And we want to have these templates readily available for us. I've kind of finessed the problem of where those templates come from in the first place. What I want you to know is that we have a whole series of mechanisms by which people who are using CEDAR are creating metadata templates in the first place. And one of the things I really want to tell you about is the idea of a metadata for machines workshop. This is something we've been doing for a couple of years in coordination with GoFair. GoFair is an organization in Europe supported by the European Open Science Cloud that has been really promoting the idea of fair data internationally. And with GoFair, we've been holding 2 or 3 day invited workshops where stakeholders get together, a leader sort of helps these scientists get together and identify what are the kinds of things that need to be included in a reporting guideline for their particular kinds of experiments. And ultimately, those reporting guidelines get translated into CEDAR metadata templates so that we start the workshop with stakeholders who are motivated to describe what are the salient things that need to be said about experiments in their field of study. We end up with a computer-based template that a system like CEDAR can operate on. GoFair has been doing metadata for machines workshops in the area of COVID. They've been working with the Danes who are interested in metadata machines workshops for wind energy experiments. We've been working recently all over Africa doing metadata machines workshops for people who are really interested, in this case, in COVID, trying to be able to annotate data from electronic health records in order to be able to come up with the kinds of metadata that will allow public health scientists to be able to track the epidemic there. So CEDAR is still in its early stages, but it's used routinely by several large research consortia. And what's really interesting, there are several funding agencies. First one was in the Netherlands that is saying, look, we want our data to be fair. We want to have reporting guidelines and ontologies that allow us to have metadata templates that are reusable by our grantees. And so these funding agencies are actually requiring that investigators use CEDAR to create metadata that are guaranteed to make their data sets fair. I want to acknowledge Templeton, who is about to fund a project that was initiated by DataCite, where CEDAR will be an important component of a large ecosystem of technologies centered all around fair data. And want to tell you, anyone can come to our website, metadatacenter.org, become a CEDAR user. And we have 1,000 people right now who are using CEDAR, not in any kind of formal consortium, but on their own, because they recognize the importance of creating good metadata in order to have fair data. And as always, we're an academic group. We'd love to collaborate. Drop me an email if you think you'd like to collaborate and learn more about good metadata and about CEDAR. So we're going to leave you with the idea that the world is getting obsessed about the idea of fair data, but we're never going to have fair data until we can actually standardize metadata into reusable, agreed upon structures that are endorsed by scientific communities that basically are in the form of metadata templates. We're not going to have fair data until those templates get filled in with controlled terms. And we need technology like CEDAR that make it easy to fill in those templates. And frankly, we need investigators who appreciate that creating good metadata and thereby good data sets is just part and parcel of good science. And let me stop there.
Great, thank you. I think your pups was saying, well done. Thank you so much, Mark. It was really very interesting. I just want to share. Oh, and actually the captions were quite helpful as well. So well done. I do think that they were might be a setting on your Zoom, but they said it's helpful. So good. We should integrate for others. We launched a poll quite much earlier in the talk about, and I'll just share the results here. So it looks like it's pretty much split amongst our attendees. 46% have published a data set before associated with the publication, and 54% have not. Is that expected, or is that kind of what we see in other areas as well? Either one.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to comment that, yeah, you do get some, from what we see, obviously we often speak to people, by running a repository, we speak to people who publish data, so it's always skewed in our minds. But you also see that you get different take-ups in different areas of research. Some areas of research lend themselves to data publishing a lot more easy and have been kind of, there's a mention of genomics, and as a former geneticist myself, you know, that GenBank came around, and that was just, you know, the first human genome was only sequenced in 2001. It's an old subject, but you know, the technology's only been relatively recent. So when this technology came about, there was already this best practice in place, whereas some of the much older research areas don't lend themselves, haven't previously lent themselves as well. But this is where I think it's very important when what we define as data, because data is your files. What are the files you create from your research, whether it's, you know, neuroscience brain images or you know, the video or recording of the play that you just did, or the script for the play. There's lots of different types of data in lots of different fields.
I think those numbers are not unreasonable, but they're going to be changing, because I think increasingly the emphasis is on making data available. People are recognizing that science is not creating PDFs, but actually creating data. And we want the output of our experiments to be available in a way which other people can take advantage of them. And particularly as publishers insist that the data be made available, and as funders insist that the data be made available, I think increasingly people are going to be putting their data online more and more because they have to. And also, I would hope, because they want to.
Yeah, good points. Feel free to please add any more questions in the question answer, or to raise your hand, but we do have a question from Professor Billingsley. I wonder whether there are biases that are sewn into the systems, because some people will be more active than others at first in creating those metadata labels. Can there really be standardized? Is this a realistic hope? I'm thinking that here of a project that mapped genomes, but some genomes at first rather than others.
Well, I think it's a really hard question. I guess I can try to answer that. And that is, there are biases that are at different levels. I think the biology community in particular has been increasingly aggressive about wanting to standardize terms, create ontologies, and create better metadata. And it's really cultural. I don't think there's anything specific that I can point to that will tell you why, but there's just peer pressure, I think, among life scientists to do a better job of making their data more available. And I think there are other scientific communities where there's less peer pressure and where people don't see that impetus quite so much. The challenge, of course, is that there are various perspectives that people can take on how to describe phenomena in the world. And there are lots of ugly battles that take place about what is the correct ontology by which you describe something. And the good news is that we can create mappings across ontologies. There doesn't have to necessarily be one ontology to rule them all in a particular area of science. And I think we are open to different perspectives, but it really is, it is a hard problem, because people who have different takes on the science, people who do different kinds of experiments, may want to emphasize different things in the way they describe the world, and that's perfectly okay.
So another question. Do you know of anywhere a researcher can go for support for if they wanted to start off with a data sharing plan? Like, where should they go?
I know a few places. There's DMP Tool, which is an automated one. If you're based within a university, they may also have a local version of DMP Tool, which is a kind of step-by-step framework for creating that data management plan. And then when you have that data management plan, there is, you know, one of the questions is, where are you going to make your data available? And as I said before, you should always look for a subject-specific repository where you might get some hand-holding, you might get some curation. And if there's nowhere else, go for a generalist repository. But you should always go for the top ones first. And there's a website called Re3Data, re3data.org, I think, which is a list of all of the different repositories. So you can probably find one in your field as well, where you can make your data available.
I'll also add that academic science libraries are recognizing increasingly that data sharing is an important part of their portfolio. And for those who are at academic centers, there are increasingly personnel at libraries who are there to help people learn how to share their data. And sometimes being led by the hand through some of these technologies can be very helpful.
I was just trying to find the link for our E3 data. I got in there. The questions. So this is a question. I've never shared my research data before. What is the first thing that I should do? Like how should I get started?
It's a little subjective, because if it is, you know, I'd go to Re3Data, put in your field of research, see if there's a repository for you. And then if you get some hand-holding, it's always very useful. But if not, ask around, ask on Twitter and things like this, and people can help you out. And then the key thing that I think both Mark and I would agree on is make sure it's well described. Think about it like it was you're trying to promote your YouTube movie to get as many hits as possible. If you call that YouTube movie video, nobody is going to find that. So call it, you know, my wonderful video explaining this X, Y, and Z. Maybe don't put wonderful, maybe keep it academic, but, you know, the stem cells moving towards VEGFR in a, you know, bovine serum solution. And then if people are looking for that, they will Google it and it makes it more discoverable. And that is what I would say is the most important thing. Add as much metadata, link it to the paper it's associated with, so it gives as much in-routes as possible for people to find the data and build on top of it. And, you know, it opens up doors. We've got so many stories about collaborations, people getting funding on grants, people having people approach them because they've made all of these different research outputs available. It just widens your scope for how you can improve your impact in your career.
And it's a question in the question answer. How do we communicate some of these aspects to journals when we target our papers to them? For example, best practice in entering metadata or framing our queries on data sharing. What are the sort of questions we should be asking the managing editors of the journals?
Those are great questions. And I think often the journal will be actually turning things around and telling you what reporting guidelines they expect for different classes of experiment, or where they anticipate you'll be putting your data, or they're telling you that they simply won't review your paper until it conforms to their requirements for data sharing. But I think often there's a dialogue between authors and publishers. And I think having a conversation about where they would like to see the data and basically what are their requirements for data publication is really important. And usually the instructions for authors will say that. But it's a really important issue, because increasingly what we're seeing is not that scientists are asking journals what they should do, but the journals are being very explicit about data must be shared, and they must be shared using the appropriate standards.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, I think, as Mark said, you know, if you're publishing in the Public Library of Science PLOS, they have had a mandate that you need to make the data available since 2016. So you can't publish with them without it. And the other journals are following suit. If you're looking to publish with Springer Nature, every single journal has one of 4 policies, which is either you should be making your data available is the most relaxed one, all the way up to you have to make your data available or we won't accept the publication. One thing I should mention as well is we often hear that there's, you know, it's if people are looking for a reason not to do it, they can find a reason not to do it. And so one of them we see a lot is, well, I don't want to publish my data sets. I don't want to come to Figshare or any other repository, publish my data set, send in my paper to Nature, and then say, you know, it references the data set in the paper, and then have the paper rejected and my data set is out there and it's persistent and all, I'm losing the competitive advantage I had of this data set. What you can do with a lot of technology systems and a lot of repositories is you can upload the data, keep it private, generate a private link and reserve the DOI. So you can say, here is the DOI, it's not live yet, but if the reviewers want to see the data, that's the private link to it. And then when the paper gets published, you push publish, the DOI is minted, and it all works out. So if you're sat here thinking, well, I can see how this would work for some researchers, but it won't work for me because of reason X, I can guarantee you it's been thought about, and I can guarantee you there's a solution.
Okay, great. Another question, what is your most compelling argument to get someone who is hesitant to make their data public because they are afraid of competition to make their data publicly available? Maybe somewhat answered that, but go ahead.
Yeah, everybody is afraid of being scooped. But frankly, as Mark just said, because the publication of the data can be timed with the publication of the manuscript, that really is not a very compelling issue. I think some people are worried that somebody else will reanalyze their data in the future and make discoveries that the original investigator should have made but didn't. That's life. That's science. And I don't have a lot to say to that, except that that's actually a good outcome from my perspective, that people can actually derive new insight from someone else's data. I think increasingly, though, people recognize the importance of putting data online and making it open, frankly, as a consequence of what is often referred to as the reproducibility crisis in science, which began about a decade ago and has actually caused scientists to have a lot of difficulty in getting credibility with the lay public. And our work is often brought into question, and the ability to claim that we're making our data available so that other people can poke at it and examine it actually is probably the best argument we have to claim that our results have credibility and people should trust them.
I'd go for the counter sway there, which is all of that is good and all of that is great. And you can always lean on people and say, you know, what are you in academia for, right? Aren't you supposed to be trying to make the world a better place by doing your job? Isn't that what you're in it for? But it's not always the case. And some people like to say yes to that, and it might not be true, right? They might be just like, I'm just trying to pay my mortgage. So I like to go with the angle of, which has been the thread through my talk, you know, every academic deep down, if they want to succeed, wants to be famous. And I don't mean Kim Kardashian famous, I mean famous in your own field. You're not going to win the Nobel Prize if no one's heard of you. You're not going to win that grant if you can't demonstrate all of the amazing impact that your work has had. So you can go the one thread and try and publish a few papers, particularly early career researchers, a few papers, or you can publish everything that you have and therefore cast your net wider and therefore become more famous in your field and therefore do well in your career and pay your mortgage.
Okay, there's another question as well. Is data sharing more of quantitative data, or are there also outlets for more qualitative as well?
I can just talk from the Figshare perspective here. Figshare has been going 10 years this year. As I mentioned, I was a stem cell biologist. I started sharing my own research data in the life sciences. And you do see people who are sharing, predominantly you see more neuroscience data, more genomics data as the big ones, but humanities data is largely up there. And I'd go back to that question of, are you generating files? And if you're generating files with your research, then yes, there is a place for it. Files plus metadata equals publishing, right? And that can work for all kinds of data. If you're generating files, there's a home for it on the internet.
I just also want to jump to a comment that Nisha not added to the chat, which might kind of speak to that as well. She's wondering whether we need to extend the principles further, like would work in educational media production, and it strikes her that the metadata standards are important beyond research data, and that we should also be using standards like this for metadata tied to open educational resources, media assets, etc.
I say absolutely, yeah.
My comment to that would be that sometimes things from non-academic world catch up on things faster than the academic world. You know, I often read newspapers online that have better data visualization than academia trying to explain complex ideas. And I think the best, analogy for that is look how much Netflix pays for related content algorithms from researchers. They had like a $5 million prize for who could find the best algorithm. And that is because they know the power of the metadata to get you what you want. And that's how we should be thinking about it in academia as well. Metadata is gold. It's also a love note to future you, because I always used to look back on my research data and be like, what was this? When did I do this? S1 version 6? What does that mean?
Question, are there funding sources to support these efforts?
And the answer is absolutely. And this is a good opportunity to thank Templeton right now for not only this seminar series, but as I mentioned, my colleagues at DataSet are being supported to create this whole ecosystem that shows the importance of data sharing. And I think the results that come out of that project will be very important. But there are lots of others. As I mentioned, or actually I didn't mention it, but CEDAR is supported currently by a consortium of funders led by the Wellcome Trust and the Research on Research Institute in the UK. But that These includes the Swiss Science Foundation, the Canadian Health Agency, and a bunch of other funders. There's a lot of interest among funders because all of them recognize that this is really the wave of the future. As I alluded in my talk, ZonMV, which is the health funding agency in the Netherlands, is now requiring that if anybody wants to get money from them, they have to commit to open science. They have to work with CEDAR to create metadata templates that will be part of the published data when their work is completed. And basically, they're making it a contingency of funding that all the work be open and use these kinds of standards. So I think this is where the world is going.
Great. I think that's all of the questions that we have in the chat and in the question and answer section. Is there anything else that you two would like to add, or?
I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to talk, and for those 46% of people who haven't shared their data, what are you waiting for? If you've got a valid excuse, email me, mark@figshare.com.
Yeah, we should add it to the chat.
No, thanks, Chris, for the opportunity to talk about this work. This is really important. I'm really glad that the Templeton World Charitable Foundation is doing this seminar series. It's just important for investigators to know about this mode of thought increasingly, because not only is this just the best way of doing science, but increasingly we're all going to have to do science this way.
Okay, awesome. I really appreciate both of your time. We can host it and support and do the tech part of the Zoom webinars, but we don't have the expertise in this area. So really appreciate you both joining us today. So for all of the attendees, please feel free to get in touch with any of one of us if you have any questions. And I'm going to share my screen because I think that there's some QR codes on here that might help you. You can join our next webinar. On October 14th, we'll be talking about pre-registration and the benefits for the research and the researcher. And please also send any feedback on this webinar and let us know if there's a topic you'd like us to focus on in a future one. We'd love to find the experts and host it as well. You can send it at open@templetonworldcharity.org. The email is also on the slide there. And we just really, and this webinar is recorded, and I'll have it up on our website tomorrow. And you should also receive an email from Zoom with the link to it. Thank you both. I really appreciate it. It was great. It's a great hour.